In the following forum in the China Masters series, Professor Lin Yifu, Dean of the Institute of New Structural Economics at Peking University, discusses China's new economic era in the face of escalating trade conflicts. Professor Lin begins by providing statistics showing how rapidly China's economy has grown over the past 40 years. He suggests this growth rate will be maintained given China's significant potential for innovation and industrial upgrading, and explains how China's sizable domestic market provides space for further economic development. He also analyzes the impact of the current Sino-US trade war and how it may affect China's economic prospects.
This year is the 40th anniversary of China's transition from a planned economy to a market economy, and China enters into a new era. Not only so, this year is also the 10th anniversary of the global financial crisis. So I will begin my analysis from a reflection of China's new era and also the global economy. 40 years ago, China was one of the poorest countries in the world, as you know. At that time, the per capita GDP, according to World Bank, was only $156. And it was less than 1/3 of the average in sub-Saharan African country. At that time, their per capita GDP was $490. And China was also a very inward-looking country. Export in 1978 was only 4.1% of China's GDP. Import was only 5.6%. Combined, it was only 9.7%. That means 90% of China's GDP, China's economy, had nothing to do with the global economy. And at that time, 75% of the export was either agricultural product or processed agricultural product. And on that humble basis, China maintained 9.5% growth in the past 39 years already. And the trade growth was 14.5%, again, in the past 39 years. And we never observed such a high growth rate to be maintained for such a long time. So as a result, by the time of 2009, China overtook Japan to be the second largest economy in the world, measured by market exchange rate. And in 2010, China's export overtook Germany to be the largest exporting country in the world. And then 97% of the export were manufacturing product. So China got the nickname of factory of the world. And historically, we know, after the Industrial Revolution, the factory of the world was Britain. And in the later 19th century, up to the first half of the 20th century, US was the factory of the world. And in the post-world, Germany and Japan were the factory of the world. Now China becomes the factory of the world. And in 2013, trade in China overtook US to be the largest trading country in the world. Trade, I mean import and export. And in 2014, measured by purchasing power parity, the Chinese economic size overtook US to be the largest economy in the world. And with this kind of performance, last year, in the 19th Party Congress, President Xi Jinping announced China entering into a new era. There are many dimensions of the new era. And today, I'd like just to mention 2 dimensions. The first one, yes, China performed very well in the past. But reforms will be always on the road. The reason that China was able to avoid the transition collapse, as we observed in former Soviet Union and Eastern European countries, was because China adopted a pragmatic, dual-track, gradual approach during the transition. China continued to provide some kind of necessary protection and subsidies to the large-scale, capital-intensive, state-owned enterprises and to maintain stability. But at the same time, China liberalized the entry to the labor-intensive, small-scale light manufacturing, which were consistent with China's comparative advantages. So China was able to achieve dynamic economic growth. But China also paid cost for this kind of pragmatic approach because the necessity to protect all the sectors means China needed to require the government intervention and distortion in the economic system. And those kind of intervention and distortion certainly create a rent, and you're going to have rent seeking that means corruption. And those kind of rent also causing the redistribution of income, and as a result, we see the widening of income disparity in China. And certainly, there's some political and social cost for the corruption and for the widening of income disparities. Reform need to be continued in a sense that at the early stage of the reform, because China was a poor country, capital was scarce. And those kind of large-scale capital-intensive state-owned sectors, when again China's comparative advantages, without protection and subsidy, they could not survive. And if China tried to remove all the protection and subsidies or distortions, then China will have to face the same situation as in former Soviet Union or Eastern European country, the collapse of economy. So it was right for the Chinese government to provide protection and subsidy at that time. But now China is a high middle income country. Capital is not scarce anymore. And then many of those older sectors turn from when again China's comparative advantage now become China's comparative advantages. Protection and subsidy is unnecessary anymore. And so reform need to be deepening. And that was the program announced by the Chinese government in 2013 to have a comprehensive reform in the economic system so the market can play a decisive role in the resource allocation. And the underlying implication is that the Chinese government would remove all the remaining distortion and in the economic system. And from 2013 to now, the Chinese government already adopted more than 300 reform packages that covering almost every sector in China. Certainly, it will take time to implement those kind of reform package. But not only so, even China can implement all those reform packages. New problems will emerge all the time because there's no perfect system in the world. So that means Chinese government or Chinese economy will have to be on the road of the reform all the time, even in the new era. That is the first dimension I'd like to mention. And the second one I'd like to mention is that Chinese economy has already maintained 39, and this year before the years, of 9.5% growth. And how long that China can maintain such a high growth rate is a big issue in China and also in the global communities. Many people were pessimistic about the growth in China because other economies to have a sustained period of growth in general after 20 years, their growth rate would drop down from about 8% down to 6, 5, or even 4%. And some people like Larry Summers wrote a very influential article to say the normal growth rate for a country is 3% to 3.5%. And China will have to drop down to that normal growth rate. There's no way to avoid that. And certainly, those hypothesis is confirmed by some kind of continually slowing down the Chinese economy So some people started to get pessimistic about the growth in the Chinese economy. However, if we want to understand the possibility for growth, we need to understand the mechanism of growth. The growth certainly means the income of the people rise all the time. But if you want to raise the income of the people, you need to improve the productivity. And how to improve the productivity? To have a technological innovations in the existing industrial sectors that you produced. Or to have a higher value-added new industrial sector to emerge so you can reallocate your resources from the old sector to the new sectors. Those are the two mechanisms to raise the labor productivity in any country. And it's the same between high-income country or developing country like China. But there's one difference. For the high-income country, they have a high labor productivity. That means they have the best technology today, and their value added in their industry are among the highest in the world. And for them, if they want to have the technological innovation and the industrial upgradings, that means what? That means they would have to invent the technology for the new industries. And certainly, the invention of new technology or industry are very risky. And that's the reason why, for the high-income country, as Larry Summers described, only average they grow at 3% to 3.5% per year. That is their normal growth rate. But for a developing country, there are something called the latecomers advantages. Because in the process of industrial upgrading and technology innovation, China still can benefit from the technological gap with the high-income country, and to learn, to absorb, and to re-innovate by that way. And if a developing country know how to use those kind of potential, latecomers advantages, a developing country can grow faster than the high-income country. And that was the main mechanism that China maintained 9.5% growth in the past 39 years. But the issue is that China already used the potential for 39 years, and this year will be 40 years. How big the potential will be? I think how big the potential will be does not depend on how long you already use that potential. How big of the potential depends on how large the gap between your technological labor, industrial labor, with the high-income countries' technological and industrial labor. The data that I can use to do analysis is that the best way to see the technological gap with the high-income country is to look into the gap between the per capita GDP. Because the per capita GDP is indicators of average productivity of the country. And the data that I can use to make the analysis was a historical data released by a famous historian, Angus Madison. He passed away in 2011, and he released the data in 2010. In that data set, the latest year was 2008. In 2008, the per capita GDP measured by purchasing power parity in China was 21% of the US. It was similar to Japan in 1951, Singapore in 1967, and Taiwan, China in 1975, South Korea in 1977. And these four East Asian economies utilized the latecomers advantages, achieved 20 years of 8 to 9% growth. They realized. So with the same mechanism, if they can realize the growth for 20 years of 8 to 9%, so certainly then China has a potential to grow at 8% from 2008 to 2028. And this year, 2018, so there should be another 10 years of 8% growth potential for the Chinese economy. But the growth potential only look at the supply side, the possibility of technology. And to realize the potential also require on the situation in the demand side. And I will analyze the reason why China started to have a slowdown in its growth and lower than 8%. was demand-side issue. I will analyze that later. So that's my second reflection. In the new era, China still has a high potential to grow dynamically in the coming 10 or even longer years. The second thing I'd like to mention, this year is the 10th anniversary of the 2008 global financial crisis. And I'd like to say, high-income countries, even after 10 years, have not fully recovered. Among the high-income countries, US is considered to perform the best. But if we look into the growth rate in the US, 2016, the US growth rate was 1.5%. In 2017, the US growth rate was 2.3%. And this year, many people are a bit about the US growth. But according to the IMF and the World Bank prediction, this year, the US growth rate is likely to be 2.7%. And it's still lower than the 3 to 3.5% the US used to have. And also, if a country fully recovers from a crisis, they should have a few years of growth rate higher than 3.5, sometimes 4, 5, or 6%, 1 or 2 years. But so far, US has not had those kind of performance yet. And also, according to the IMF and World Bank, the US growth rate in 2019, next year, is likely to drop from 2.7% this year down to 2.5% next year. And in 2020, the US growth rate will be around 2%. So US economy has not fully recovered yet. And European economy, they have up and down around 1.5% in the past decades, and in the coming years, likely to be the situation again. And Japan, since 1991, Japan has struggling around 1% growth every year. So from this, all the high-income countries has not fully recovered yet. And why they have not fully recovered yet? Because high-income countries have not carried out the necessary structural reform to resume their dynamic economic growth. Structural reform is important. I think everyone knows. And that's the reason why in 2016 G20 meeting in Hangzhou, they have a consensus. Every country should do the structural reform. But structural reform in high-income countries is very difficult. How come? Because the content of the structural reform in high-income countries is to reduce the welfare to the workers, to deleverage in their financial system, and to reduce the deficit of their governments, and also to share off, to remove inefficient sectors in their economy. If they can do that, certainly their economy will be more competitive, their economy will have more resilience to the shocks. That should be good, but in the long run. In the short run, if the government wanted to do the structural reform, they are all contractionary. Reducing the demand, reducing the investment, and they will further replace the growth rate and increase the unemployment rate. So politically, it's very hard to implement. Certainly, some countries were hit by crisis like 1997 East Asian financial crisis. At that time, when a country was hit by crisis, in general, they will go to IMF for rescue. Then IMF will ask them to implement 3 policies simultaneously. One is structural reform to resume their competitiveness. Second one is to devalue their currency, so to increase their export and create a space for their structural reform. And then the IMF will give them certain funds to weather through the transition period. But this time, these 3 prescriptions were not applicable. The main reason is because all the high-income countries, they encounter the crisis simultaneously. They all have the structural problems. And if they want to do the structural reform, they need to create space for that. And traditionally, the way to create a space for that is to increase the export by devalue the domestic currency. But since all the high-income countries, their products are competing in the global markets. And if one country wants to use devaluation as a way to create a space for their structural reform, the other country will also devalue and causing the competitive valuation as a result. No country has a space to carry out structural reform. So the theme of secular stagnation, again, advocated by Larry Summers, is likely to be a scenario for the high-income country in the coming decades. The crisis has been 10 years already, and very likely the high-income country will follow the step of Japan to have lost decades, 20 years or more. And what is the implication of that? With this kind of very slow growth and slow recovery, and we know high-income countries use monetary expansion to create some demand to avoid the further drop in their economy. But those kind of low-cost funds did not go to the real sectors. All those kind of low-cost funds went to the speculative equity markets. And for example, before the crisis in 2008, the Dow Jones Index reached 13,000 in 2007. At that time, everyone said there was a bubble in the equity market in the US. Now the real economy has not fully recovered. But as you know, that the Dow Jones Index now is about 25,000, almost double. And so it's very sensitive. And you're going to see a large fluctuation. And sometimes, I guess, a collapse is unavoidable. And not only so, because the slow recovery and use monetary expansion to support the equity market, it causing income disparity issue. The ordinary people, their job prospects were poor, but crisis started in the financial sectors. However, now who benefited most from this kind of easy money policy? Again, financial sectors. So certainly you causing the income disparity to become even bigger, and people, they do not know the causes. So there's a lot of, nutrient populism, the protectionism, nationalism, are the result of this kind of situation. And because of that, unexpected event happened, Brexit and the election of Trump to the president of the US are the consequence of that. And this also had consequences on other countries, especially the developing countries. The easy money policy in the US and also in Europe, causing a large speculative outflow of capital to the developing country, large outflow, large inflow, and causing challenges in the macroeconomic management. But also the slowing down in the economy replaced the trade. Before 2008 global financial crisis, trade growth rate in the world was about twice as high as the GDP growth. Now, after the 2008 crisis, the global growth has been replaced, slowing down, and trade now is even lower than the GDP growth. And certainly that has implication for all the countries, because trade means demand, and that was one reason why China cannot realize its growth potential. And certainly it also affects other BRIC countries, other emerging market economy. And this kind of slowing down in the growth certainly will causing some other unexpected phenomena in the developing country. Now many developing countries all turn right, just like the newly elected president in Brazil. It's again a result of that. And the slowing down in the growth certainly also deprived the job opportunity in many parts of the world. So you see a large out-migration of refugees from North Africa to European countries and so on. And so I think we need to prepare. The world is going to have a lot of challenges and uncertainty in the futures. And again, this backdrop, the US-China trade conflicts is a consequence of this kind of new situation. Certainly, Trump, he was elected on the basis that there's a large trade deficit in the US, and Trump used that as a way to win the elections because people were unhappy about their current situation, and they did not know the true reason, and they only saw that there was a large US trade deficit. And so after Trump was elected, he charged high tariff rate on all the major trading partners. And China certainly is one of the focus. Because in 2017, 44% of the US trade deficit was with China. And so China became the largest target. However, the US trade deficit, is that because of China trade policy as argued, or some other reason? On the surface, it seems to be China take advantage of the US because China started to have a trade surplus with the US in 1985. At that time, it was very small, only 60 million, only 0.3% of the US trade deficit. And last year, it reached 370 billion and was 44% of US trade deficit. So China seemed to gain a lot of the trade with the US. However, US was the highest income country in the world after the Second World War. And the US after the Second World War started to advocate free trade, and in the free trade, certainly, US will import goods which US did not have competitive advantages. And certainly, as a high-income country, US did not have competitive advantages in labor-intensive manufacturing goods. So in the 1950s and 1960s, at that time, US imported a lot of labor-intensive product from Japan, and the US had a trade deficit with Japan. By the time of 1960s, 1970s, Japanese wage rate rose up, and so this kind of labor-intensive manufacturing goods, the production shipped to South Korea, Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, and Singapore, and the US started to have trade deficit, not only with Japan, but also with these four East Asian dragons. By the time of 1980, when China started to transit to the market economy, and happened at that time, the East Asian economies, their wage rate also went up. And so they relocate those kind of labor-intensive manufacturing from the East Asian economy to the mainland China. So in fact, the enlarge in the trade imbalance between the US and China was just a shift of the production of cohesion. Those kind of goods, the US did not have comparative advantages, and now China happened to have comparative advantages. However, even now China contributes 44% of the US trade deficit. But in the 1980s, more than 100% of the US trade deficit with the world was with East Asian economies, including Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. And now, if you look into US trade deficit with East Asian economies, it dropped down to about 50%. So actually, the East Asian economies as a group contribute to less to the US trade deficit. And so the enlargement of the US trade deficit actually was not because of China, was not because of East Asian economies. Before 1971, US trade was basically balanced. It had the deficit with East Asian economies, but it had surplus with other economies in the world. And the US trade deficit started to become larger and larger only after the peg of the US dollar to gold, and allowed the US has unrestrained monetary policy to pay anything that he wanted to import. That's one thing. And also the peg of the US dollar to gold also contribute to the financial liberalization and other changes in the US economy. One was the reduction in the household savings due to the housing bubble and the equity bubble, and everyone feels they are so rich, so now they consume more and they save less. And also due to the US fiscal deficit, because of the war, because of unrestrained spending and unrestrained social welfare programs. And as a trend economy, we know, whenever a country consumes more and save less, the country is going to have trade deficit. In other countries, they cannot sustain those kind of trade deficit for a long time, but US has a reserve currency status, allow the US economy to print the money to purchase the goods unlimitedly. And that was the reason why the US trade deficit to become larger and larger. And since the change in the comparative advantages, China happened to be the location of the goods that the US does not have comparative advantages, and China become the largest trade surplus country with the US. Then what would happen? The US wrongly point the finger to China for its own domestic problem. The income disparity issue, the stagnation of the workers' wage, the declining of the middle income class, to the trade deficit, and China was the main reason for that trade deficit, according to the analysis. But if US, to the worst case, the import 25% tariff rate on all the goods imported from China, what would be the situation? Because those kind of goods, the US would not produce. US did not have comparative advantages in those kind of areas. So if US import those kind of tariff rate, either US will have to continue to import those kind of goods, which US does not have comparative advantages, so US will continue to import from China. Consumer will have to pay 25% more. Or the producer use Chinese import as input will also have to pay 25% more. US, certainly, there's a possibility those kind of production may relocate to Vietnam, to Bangladesh, or other low-income country. It's a possibility. However, before the trade conflicts, US can import from those goods from other countries. They did not import from other countries. That means to import from other countries will be more costly than to import from China, ultimately because of the supply chain issue. So no matter what happened, the US producers and the US consumers will have to pay higher prices for their import. Their welfare will drop. Not only so, they are going to have job loss also. Because for a household, if they have to pay more for their consumption good, then the income that they can use to purchase domestic produced service or product will be reduced. So the demand will be repressed. Similarly, if some company use Chinese input as the intermediate input to produce, then it will become more costly, and their job market will be shrink. So as a result, job will be reduced from the side. And not only so, China will have a tick for tat. China will also raise the tariff rate for the import from US, and the US will reduce its export to China, will reduce the job. So the second consequence is that the job in the US will be reduced. And not only so, the deficit, the trade deficit in the US will increase, because US, on the one hand, need to pay more for the imports, and the US will export less. And under the kind of situation, certainly the trade deficit in the US will increase. So trade war certainly is not good for China, but it's also not good for the US economy and for the US people. But we cannot control that, right? So let's estimate. If US impose the high tariff rate according to what the US said, then what would be the impact on the Chinese economy? And according to the some model estimation, likely the Chinese growth rate will be reduced by 0.5 percentage point. If all the pledge has been implemented, China certainly will be affected. And that will be about 5 percentage point of the China's growth. But how high China's growth is going to be, that's the issue, right? And as I said, China, up to 2028, has a potential of 8% growth. How much that 8% growth can be realized? On the one hand, depends on the global economy, and I seem to be pessimistic about the global economy, so the export cannot be as, grow as rapidly as in the past. Now, assume the situation, there was no trade war, but the global economy is slowing down. That assume the first scenario. And about that scenario, if China want to maintain a reasonably high growth rate, China will have to rely more on the domestic demand. And the domestic demand has two sources. One is investment demand. The other one is consumption demand. So we can look at investment. Does China still has good investment opportunity? That should be the question. But in fact, China still has many, many good investment opportunity. The first one, even though we talk about the excess capacity in the Chinese economy and so on, yes, China has some excess capacity. But all those excess capacity are in the medium or low value added sectors. China can continue to have an industrial upgrade into higher value added sectors. And China can also be very competitive in the new economy. All those are good investment opportunities. And will generate high return to the investors. Secondly, China can also improve the infrastructure. China made a lot of investment in the infrastructure in the past, mainly to link a city to other city, like highway, high-speed train, airport, port facilities. But inner city infrastructure in China is still very poor. And China can also make investment in those kind of areas, and that will generate high social return. And the third area of investment is environment. In the past 40 years, growth rate in China was very high, but environmental deterioration is also very alarming. And China needs to improve the environment. And the improvement environment also require the investment. And the fourth area of investment is urbanization. Last year, the urban population was 58.5% of China's total population, 58.5. But we know all the high-income countries, their urbanization rate exceeds 80%. So China is still on the process of urbanization. When rural people move from rural areas to urban areas, they need housing, they need to have public services, and all those areas require investment. So China still has many, many good investment opportunities. This is something China, as a middle-income country, differs from the high-income country. Like in the US, in European country, or in Japan. With the slowing down or recession in the economy, they should make investment. However, they don't have good investment opportunity. Their industry are already on the global frontiers. And the slowing down means there's some excess capacity in those kind of sectors. And so if they want to make investment, they will have to find new industries. But new industries is very hard to find. And as a result, they don't have good investment opportunity for upgrading industries. And the infrastructure in a high-income country, they have the infrastructure already. It may be old. But if you want to improve the older infrastructure, that means you are digging a hole, paving a hole. And the productivity cannot be increased. But developing country like China, infrastructure is a bottleneck. So the make investment in the infrastructure will improve the productivity. But make investment in the infrastructure in a high-income country will not contribute to the growth, the future growth. And that's the reason why the high-income country, they have so-called Ricardian equivalence. And many people against the government to use infrastructure investment as a counter-cyclical interventions. And a high-income country, the environment is also good. Urbanization has already reached the maturity. So they don't have good investment opportunity. That is one thing China differs from other high-income countries during the same slowing down in the global economy. And if you want to make investment, you need to have funding. And competitively, China is also in a very good shape because they combine the government deficits, both central government and local governments. The combined deficit in China it's only 57%. And we know high-income countries, their deficit in general exceeding 100%. Other developing countries in general also exceeding 100%. And not only 57%. China used most of those deficits to make investment in the infrastructure and so on. So there's some asset there. And last month, IMF released a new paper to say, when we talk about the government deficit situation, we should not only look at the deficit. We also need to look at the equity, the asset side. And the Chinese government used the deficit to make investment, and those kind of investment always create the asset. So the net debt in China actually is much smaller than the 57% indicated. And if we talk about issue about the government deficit, actually it's not the level of the government debt. When I say 57% government debt, actually including those kind of investment vehicles and implicitly guaranteed by the local government. Those are all combined. And if we talk about the government debt in China, the main issue is not at the level. The main issue is the local government in the past. They cannot have a deficit. So they use investment vehicle to borrow short-term money from banks or shadow banking to make long-term investment. So there was some kind of term mismatch. Now with this understanding, in 2015, the central government changed its policy, allowed the local government to issue infrastructure investment bonds. Those are long-term instruments to finance long-term infrastructure investment. So with that, I think that if necessary, the central government in China can start another run of fiscal expansion to support infrastructure investment. And not only the government is good financial position, the private sector actually is also in a very good financial position, because saving rate in China is around 50%, among the highest in the world. As long as the people have the confidence about the future. And with all those kind of industrial upgrading opportunities, and then use the government investment to leverage the private sector investment. And there's a big potential there. And the third one, that if you want to make investment, certainly you need to import equipment, technology, machinery, and China has $3 trillion of reserve, among the highest in the world. Those are the advantage of China. And this is also make China differ from other emerging market economy. Other emerging market economy like Russia, India, or Brazil, or Turkey, they should also have good investment opportunity like China. But they are either constrained by poor physical position, or low saving, or lack of foreign reserve. So they can realize that their potential. But China has no limitation of that. So with this analysis, I think that China can maintain reasonably high investment growth rate. And if China maintains reasonably high investment growth rate, jobs will be created. And household income will continue to rise. Consumption certainly will continue to grow. And with this investment growth rate and consumption growth rate, my position is that no matter what kind of global situation, from now to 2020, China should be able to maintain 6.5% growth around. And from 2020 to 2035, China should be able to maintain around 5% growth rate. From 2035 to 2050, China should be able to maintain around 4% growth rate. And if there's a trade war continue up to 2050, what will be the scenarios? And I mentioned, the impact will be 0.5 percentage point of the growth. So from now to 2020, that China should be able to maintain about 6% growth rate. From 20 to 2035, China should be able to maintain about 4.5% growth rate. And from 2035 to 2050, should be able to maintain around 3.5% growth rate. But what is the implication of those growth rate? If China maintains 6% growth rate, currently the Chinese GDP is about 16% of the global GDP, measured by market exchange rate. And China will contribute about 1 percentage point to the global growth. Currently, the global growth is about 3%. So China will contribute about 30% to the global growth. And by the time of 2020 to 2035, certain growth rate will drop. But the Chinese economy will continue to be enlarged, right? So again, even with 5% around, China will continue to contribute about 1% growth. And global economy is like to be around 3%. China will continue to contribute about 30% of global growth. And similarly, even after 2035, China is likely to continue to contribute about the 30% of growth. That is a likely scenario. So with this kind of analysis, what should be China's responses to the US challenges of a trade war? I think that China should continue to be the champion of free trade, because trade is always a win-win for everyone. If US does not like to benefit from the trade, we should not deprive other countries to benefit from the free trade. So China should continue to advocate, to champion the free trade. That's one thing. Secondly, China should deepen the reform. As I mentioned, there are many areas that China still lag behind. There are still many distortions. China should deepen the reform and to improve the system in order to tap into the growth potential I just described. Not only the deepening reform, China should also deepen the opening up, allow other countries to benefit from the growth in China. And if US wanted to have a trade war, China certainly will adopt a tit for tat. That means what? Then the US will be deprived the opportunity to grow with China. But it would be a good news for Japan. It would be a good news for Korea. It would be a good news for the European Union. Because as long as China grows, China will have to import more. And if US do not want to compete with them, then the market will be available for other economies. Certainly it will also be good. If China can continue this kind, good for Hong Kong. If the mainland part can continue this growth, certainly the dream of national reachable nation will be realized. And Hong Kong will be the most dynamic, highest income cities in this dynamic growing Chinese economy. Thank you very much.